There's a little bit of teaching I have to do with this passage because it's a tricky passage. And what I love about the word is the word doesn't shy away from hard situations or difficulty. It doesn't I just think sometimes we like to pick and choose the scriptures. But I love it with Pastor Harrison. He doesn't shy away from anything. And I think we can't revise the scriptures. We have to let the scriptures revise us. Is a quote I heard on the podcast the other day. So we're going to look at the story. It's a little more challenging. I'm going to just warn you, I actually don't have all the answers. This story is very layered, and I still have questions that I'm wrestling with, and that's okay with the Word of God, but I think there's just still some truths that we can get. So this is an Old Testament story. Old Testament means before Jesus. It's the front half of your Bible. Okay, and so before Jesus is the Old Testament, and David has become king. David is a pretty big figure in the Old Testament. You see him coming up time and time again. He wrote the Psalms. And so David's becoming king. And he has this goal. He wants to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. That is his goal. Now, what is the Ark of the Covenant? So I have a picture up here. The Ark of the Covenant is just like a box, but it was a very, very special box to the Israelites because it is where God's presence dwelled. So one thing you have to understand about before Jesus, God was so holy. He could not dwell with his people because of sin. So sin came into the world, and we're broken and we're sinful. And so God, when his holiness would come, or when his presence would come, we were so sinful that if we got too close of it, we would actually die because he is so holy. But God was like, I want to dwell with my people. I want to make a way for them to be right with me. And so he told them to put the 10 Commandments in the Ark of the Covenant. And what the Ark of the Covenant would do is it would sit in the middle of a tent or a tabernacle, and it would sit in the very center in a place called the Holy of Holies. Now, there's a few things you need to know about the Ark. One, it symbolized the presence of God. It is the dwelling place of God in the Old Testament. Second, that God is holy, so there's very specific rules for the Ark. It had limited access. Not just anybody could go see the Ark. No, not just anybody could get into the presence of God. Actually, you had to be a Levite, which was a priest. You had to be somebody that was set apart. And even then, they only went once a year. So access was limited, but the next thing you know is the only way to be made right with God. So they would offer sacrifices, and the blood they'd sprinkle on the Ark of the Covenant, it would actually make the people right with God. Because it says in the Bible, without the shedding of blood, that there's no forgiveness of sins. So this is kind of what I need you to understand. So hopefully you're still following. Ark of the Covenant symbols the dwelling presence of God. So what I love about the Ark is throughout the Old Testament, it was placed in the center of the community. So even when they had tents, they would actually put the Ark in the center, and they would make all their tents face the Ark. And that was their way of their community saying, we will center our lives around the presence of God. We will center our lives around God. So what happens is the Ark gets stolen during war by the Philistines. And so they steal it. And it causes them so much trouble, they send it back. They're like, this is causing us, because you can't dwell in the presence of God if you're not holy, if you're not made perfect. So they send it back, and it's just sitting in Abinadab's house. It's just sitting there. So David's like, I want to make the Ark, the presence of God, the center of the community once again. This is where we take off. So David has this intention. He's like, I want the presence of God to come back to Jerusalem. That is his goal. He wanted the closeness of the presence of God. So I think we look at it, and David's intentions are really good. So I want to ask you, what's your intention? Why do you come to church? What's your desire? Do you desire to become close to God? Where's your starting point? So our starting point today is that his intention was good. He wanted to center the community around God. But as we kind of read, what went wrong? So they set the ark, so this is 2 Samuel 6, verse 3. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which is on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. So what's the significance of this? What is different? If you look, the first thing that kind of pops out in the passage is that they put it on a new cart. Now, a cart seems really sensible. The Ark of the Covenant was heavy. It wasn't a light object. So a cart makes sense. Here's the problem. They didn't go back to God's design. And the God's design for the ark, if you look, there was poles, and it was for Levites to carry it on their shoulders. It was designed to be carried by Levites, people that were set apart by God, and it was designed to be carried on the shoulders of men and women, not on a cart. So the question is, where did the idea even come from to put it on a cart? Well, the idea came from the Philistines. So the Philistines, they brought it back. They actually sent it back on a cart. So the Israelites are kind of like, David's kind of like, that's not a bad idea. That's really convenient. It's easy. It doesn't cost me anything. Man, who wants the Ark of the Covenant on your shoulders? Like, that looks heavy. That looks uncomfortable. And so what happened is David chose comfort and convenience over the pattern that God had laid out. He chose comfort and convenience. This is like, it also said it was on a hill. So could you imagine, like, you're not even carrying it on your shoulders, you're carrying it down a hill. And this is the most sacred object of your community. I don't want that responsibility. So he's like, well, let's put on a cart. A cart seems more reliable. But they chose comfort and convenience. It seemed sensible. How many of us allow comfort and convenience to drive our decisions to know how we will cultivate a relationship with God? We want God, we want the presence of God, but we're like, I'm going to choose how. I'm not going to change my routines or structures. God, like this, just like, can you just like be here? This is like my routine. I can fit you in here. Some examples, if I think about it, just even like getting up earlier is inconvenient. God's like, okay, let's spend some time in the Word. And you're like, well, I stayed up late last night. It's kind of inconvenient. I think choosing a small group, we're like, well, I don't know how busy this season is. And I think like there's life, and life is full. But I think sometimes we forget to stop and ask God, like, what do you want me in this season? We tend to schedule God into our lives rather than scheduling our life around God. We make it about convenience. I think about it this way. What's way more comfortable, tithing after my bills are paid or before? It's much more comfortable afterwards. I'm like, I'm secure, I'm comfortable, I know exactly how much money I have left to give to you, God. But God, that's not what God's called us to. That's not what he asks. I think we so we have to make it about convenience. What's the easiest way? What's the easiest way to get to God? And that's the effort I'll put in. Or maybe we make it about comfort. I really like comfort. I like predictability. I like to know where things are going. And so one of my slogans for last year was like getting uncomfortable with being uncomfortable, because I knew God was going to ask me to do things that I'd be like, nope, not me. And somebody else can do it. And I think that was kind of so my motto for last school year, I think like I like to stay in the comfort zone. Another area I like to stay in the comfort zone is with my relationships. I will encourage you forever and ever and ever, and I will be your biggest fan. But if I have to challenge you on something, I'm like, that is uncomfortable. I don't want to do it. And what God's been speaking to me about, like, is the obedience of, like, it's not about my comfort. It's not about my convenience. It's about following him and doing it his way. The problem with convenience and comfort is that it'll eventually cost you something. Well, in the short run, it's satisfying and seems to be easy solutions to our problems. In the long run, it costs us. Let's look at verse 6. When they came to the threshing floor of Nikan, so the threshing floor is actually where they filtered out the wheat and the chaff, so the good from the bad. And Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. The comfort and convenience, doing it the easy way, it eventually will cost you something. For example, my Starbucks addiction, if you looked at my bank account in the last 10 years, I actually don't want to know how much money I spent at Starbucks. I don't. It's cost me something, right? My just wanting to do what feels good in the moment has cost me something. And I think we're like thinking about what is the thing now, like thinking about now and the temporary rather than down the road. So I was debating if I'm going to tell this story, but I went on a date once. I don't talk about my dating life very often, so you guys are privileged. Oh, thanks. Okay. But I went out with this guy, and we were talking about, and I was just sharing some of my values, and he looked at me, and I was like, yeah, you have really great values. I was like, thanks. He's like, one day I want to have values like that. He's like, when I finally have kids, I'll get those values. And I just looked and I was like, those values don't come overnight. Values cost you something. And me just skating, if I just say, like, you know what, today doesn't matter, my choices today don't matter, I'm just going to skate through, and one day I'm going to wake up and like, oh, I'm not actually where I want to be because I was not willing to pay the cost. If it says in Proverbs 14:12, it says there's a path before each person that seems right, but it ends in death. If you look at the passage, it says they were bringing the ark and they were rejoicing. There's praise. It felt so right. They're like, we're honoring God. We're going to bring the presence of God. We're in unity. Everyone's rejoicing. It feels right. But I think they thought they knew a better way, and we often count on our feelings or experiences to define how we're going to follow God. The problem is that our feelings need to be based on the truth of the word. If my feelings don't line up with what the word of God says, then my feelings are distorted. They need to line up with the word of God. Sure, I can buy Starbucks whenever I want. I can eat whatever I want. But where is it going to lead me? And I think too often we make decisions based on this season of life, I don't think I can invest in community. But where is that going to lead you? In 6 months, in a year, where is that going to take me? And I think it's one thing God's been convicting me on is I really like to lay low on the weekends and stay home. And God's like, there's community that I'm asking you to invest in, but if you just choose comfort, you'll miss it. I need to ask myself, am I willing to pay the cost, or am I just choosing comfort and convenience and asking God to bless my choices? So what happens when we maybe we do the right thing? We're like, my intentions are good. This feels right. But then God shows up and he's like, actually, this led you somewhere you don't want to be. What happens then? Let's look at David. I love looking at specific characters in the Bible and how they react to things, because it very reminds me of myself. You can often see yourself and be like, so David, of course, he is frustrated. He says in verse 8, then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Perez Uzzah. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? He was angry, he was confused, he was afraid. He's like, I was doing a good thing, Lord. I was following you. I was going to church, right? I was going to small group. I was, working hard at my job. I felt like I was being faithful. And then I'm just frustrated. So what do we do when we feel like we're doing the right thing, but then we end up at a dead end? What do we do? David had an error in thinking. He thought it didn't matter how he carried the presence of God, but just that he was there. He thought being in the room was enough. He thought just showing up was enough. Uzzah actually means strength, and Ahio means friendly. It's this idea that they were carrying the ark in their own strength, doing it the way that they wanted to do it. They had an error in thinking. Error in thinking leads to errors in behaviors. Uzzah thought and David thought they needed to help God. It was a good thing done the wrong way. My question is how do I respond when things don't go my own way? What David learned is how you do something is just important as what you do. So on TikTok, there's this trend going around. It's called quiet quitting. You might have heard of it, you may have not. The idea of quiet quitting is this, and it looks on the outside really, really appealing. It's this idea that I will go to work, I will do the minimum that's required of me, and then I will go home at the end of the day. It's this idea that, if I work at 8, I show up at 8. If I end at 5, I end at 5. I will do what's required of me and not a single thing more. And I think if you look at what David did, he took the culture around him and he conformed it to his own life because that felt good. It felt sensible. And I think we do that. We take something that the culture is this is good. Having boundaries is good. You don't need to do more than you need to. Just do your job description at work. That is the basic requirement. They look at that and we look at that and go, that's actually a good idea. And we bring it into our relationship with God. And we say, God, what's the minimum requirement here? What's the little bit that I have to do? And I measure it. But God, I did this for you, so you're going to do this, right? And we live in kind of this exchange culture of I'll do it for you, you do it for me, we'll exchange it. And I think that quiet quitting, I think of an example of my own life. Last year I was in a job I'm a teacher, and I was pulled out of my classroom last year to do some learning support. So I was in a new job, new position, and 2 months in, I found it that I did not like this position. I was really struggling. But you know what it led me to do? The minimum requirement. I was like, I'm going to show up at 8:30. I'll be there. I'll be present. 3:15, bell goes. I'm going home. This is too hard. And I remember the Lord talking to me one day, and he's like, you will find no joy in this season and in this place if you don't learn how to do this for me and not for somebody else. So I remember there's the verse in Colossians that says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as if for the Lord. And he had me read that verse to myself every day before I went to work. It's just like a practical way to be like, you know what? I'm not going to do the minimum requirement because I'm doing this for Jesus. I'm not doing this for a promotion. I'm not doing this to look good in the eyes of others. And that changed my attitude at work because I can do my job well and my heart cannot be in it. But the how is just as important as the what. I can come to church and I can show up and be like, well, I'm here. What more do you want? But the how is just as important as the what. How I live every single day is just as important as what I'm doing. Often we take an idea from culture, we'll bring it into our relationship with God, and it just feels good. What I love is how David responds. So he responds in anger. He's frustrated. But then what does he do? He pauses. He takes the ark and he puts it in the home of Obed-Edom. So it says, so David decided not to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom of Gath. The ark of the Lord remained there in Obed-Edom's house for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household. So what happened? When it was put in the right spot and carried by the right people, there was blessing that follows. Now, I don't want to say that if I follow God and do all the right things, that blessing's going to follow. I think what happens is the presence follows. So what David does is he pauses. He goes back to the word, and he sees what God says. And I think there's many times in our life when we're frustrated, we need to go back to the word. What does God say? What does God say about this situation? What does God say about this, about my life? It says, 1 Chronicles 15, so this is what he finds out, verse 13. Because you Levites did not carry the ark the first time, the anger of the Lord our God burst out against us. We failed to ask God how to move it properly. We just failed to ask God what he wanted. What do you do when your intentions are frustrated? You reflect and you ask the Lord. There's a season in my life, I was just turning 30, and I had this the highest level of frustration I've ever had in my walk with God. And I was so frustrated with him because I had this running kind of record in my head, this narrative that said, okay, God, this is the life I want. This is how I'm going to get there. So I was like, I'm coming to church. I'm leading worship. I'm in community. And then and then I just said, and then when it wasn't coming, I was like, God, what are you doing? Don't you see all the things I'm doing? And God just I took this season with the Lord, and he just said, did you even ask me if that's what I had in store for you? Did you even ask me if that direction was what I wanted for your life? Did you even take some time and be like, God, what's the promise for my life? Or did I just kind of assume that, this is the way culture goes. You're married by a certain age, you have kids by a certain age, and this is what my life will look like. And I just remember him taking that season of, he's like, just, will you trust and obey? And he led me out of that season. And he actually led me to kingdom. By the way, today is my 3-year anniversary of being at Kingdom Church. But I just look at, if I had chosen in that season, and this is not a pump me up, but I want you to see how this works. If I had chosen to be like, God, your way's too hard. I look at the world around me, they got it easy. They're getting exactly what they want. They're just going after it, and God, you're asking this of me? You're asking me to go and to try something new? And I think if I hadn't learned, and I think over and over that season, God's like, do you just lay it down? Will you just obey me? Will you just get into my word and ask and see what I have for your life? Will you just inquire and look to me? And that's what David did. He was driven to the word to discover that worship and bringing the presence of God has a proper order. There's a proper way to do life in the kingdom. Doing it out of comfort and convenience means I do it as it pleases me. This feels good. The worship in this church feels great. And then the worship in this church doesn't feel great, so I'm going to try somewhere else. But doing it God's way means doing what pleases him. Our greatest offering to God is obedience. Choosing to center your life around Jesus means choosing to do it his way. So what David had to learn is he had to do it God's way if he wanted the presence in his life. Choosing to center my life means that worship is about him and not about me. It means it's not about being efficient or convenience or comfort or the easiest or fastest way. It's about obeying him. Choosing to center my life around him is about choosing God's way in every season. So how does the story end? So he regroups, he pauses, he kind of goes, okay, we didn't do it God's way, and he tries again. He doesn't give up and nope, obviously it didn't work. I couldn't bring the presence of God to the center, to the city of David. But instead he's like, nope, we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it God's way. So it says in verse 12, so David went up to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf, wearing a linen ephod, and David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. While he had all Israel bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. So if you look, at first glance, it doesn't look much different than the first time. But his heart was different. And I think there's a few small differences. It says they were carrying the ark of the Lord on the shoulders of the Levites. He found the right way to do it. The second thing is he realized it cost something to follow Jesus. They offered sacrifices. So every 6 steps, they would stop and they would offer a sacrifice. And then you know what they would do? They would rejoice and celebrate and shout. And that was, the first time they worshiped and shouted, it felt right. But the second time, it was right. And they shouted and they expressed. And so it's not that our life with God isn't emotional. There's still an emotional expression with it. It costs something to follow Jesus, but it also costs you something not to follow Jesus. One of the costs of convenience that I find, the highest cost that we pay, is our presence. Our presence with people, our presence with God. I teach 3rd grade, and 8-year-olds are probably the most inquisitive people on the planet. Up there with 3-year-olds. And so I was sitting at my desk, and I like to get a million things done at once. So I'm marking, and my emails are open, and the kids are all working. And I'm set up this time that I could do my marking, because I didn't want to bring it home. I'm sitting there, and I'm okay, I'm going to get this done. I'm going to be efficient. A student comes up to me, to my desk, and goes, Miss Wolfram. And I went, what? In a really sharp tone, because I had been interrupted. And she looks at me and she asks this very sincere question, something about residential schools that she was genuinely curious about. And I remember I just felt this in my spirit that he's your efficiency and your wanting to be doing things easy and fast is going to cost you the relationships of your students. Because what they need is my presence. My teaching could be great, my assignments could be awesome, the marking could be on time, but if they don't have my presence, that I've failed them. And I think the presence of God is one of the most precious gifts that he's given us. His presence among us. The problem is that sin had kind of limited our access in the Old Testament. So the only way you get to the presence of God was to bring it in and to go into the Holy of Holies, and it was once a year, and we have that whole situation. And I think what is really beautiful about this is when they offered the sacrifice, it actually is a foreshadowing to the ultimate sacrifice. That I think sometimes we take for granted. Think about in the Old Testament, if you wanted to have an encounter with God, the amount of steps you had to go through just because you were so sinful and God was so holy. And what this did in this story is, if you look a little bit further in the book of 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles, it actually opened up the tabernacle of David, which was a place where people could come and worship. It actually opened up worship for the community, the sacrifice. And that's how they had to function until Jesus came. says in Hebrews chapter 4, "For it was not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. That is why when Christ came into the world, he said to God, 'You did not want animal sacrifices or sin offerings, but you have given me a body to offer. You were not pleased with burnt offerings or other offerings for sin. Then I said, Look, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written about me in scriptures.' Under the old covenant, the priest stands and ministers before the altar day after day, offering the same sacrifices again and again, which can never take away sins. But our high priest offered himself to God as a single sacrifice for sins, good for all time. Then he sat down in the place of honor at God's right hand. There he waits until his enemies are humbled and made a footstool under his feet. For by one offering he forever made perfect those being made holy." Come on. There's actually, if you read about the crucifixion, and I just think about the cost that Jesus paid. And he's on the cross, and right when he dies, there's a huge veil that's in front of the Ark of the Covenant, which is showing the limited access, and it tears from top to bottom to show that the access to the presence of God is no longer limited. And when Jesus came as an ultimate sacrifice for his sins, it was a way for him to say there is access for everyone to experience the presence of God. One of the greatest gifts, it is now accessible to everyone. And I think that that's the idea of God is dwelling with his people. It says that we become the temple, the tabernacle, that he's dwelling within us, that his presence goes before us, it's in us. So Jesus came and he gave up his own comfort and convenience. So think about it. You have all authority, all power, right? You've created the world. You're outside of time and space. Yet you choose to lay it all aside, to come down for people that are stubborn, for people that are sinful, for people that make dumb choices on a daily basis. And he comes and he says, you know what? I love them so much, and I want to dwell with them in such a mighty way that I will give everything. I will come as a baby, as an uncomfortable baby. I will learn how to walk and talk, and I will live among the people, and I will go to the cross and take it was such a shameful death. I will be uncomfortable. I will be inconvenienced so that the people that I love can experience my presence and my peace and my hope and the love I have for them. And I think this is what he invites us into, to access the presence of God. God's not mad at you. He wants to be part of your life. The world says if you're a good person, you can make it to heaven. But Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. We can't handle Jesus however we want. We can't handle the presence of God just however we want, because there is only one way. So how do we center our lives around him? I think we need to realize that the cost we pay is nothing compared to the cost that he paid. It's nothing. The inconvenience that I might go through, but you know what God's saying, stop. I know you're rushing, but that person, they need you to notice them. Hey, I know you have plans, but stop. That child needs you. I know you need to get things done, but stop. And just notice what I'm doing right now and ask me, God, what is your way? What is your way? God is calling you, and he wants the best for you, but will you do it his way? Will you choose his way when it's inconvenient and uncomfortable? Will you choose your way when it's hard? I think it's really easy to follow God when life is easy, but it's when life is hard. I like this. There's a speaker, and she talks about being 100 little yeses. That every day I have the opportunity to make thousands of little yeses to become closer to Jesus, to choose his way over my way. And that's what actually develops us into the people we want to be. It's not the big yeses. It's the 1,000 little yeses that got me there. The 1,000 times I was like, you know what, God, I'm going to choose your way. And when I don't choose your way, God, will you correct me? Will you humble me? Will you show me where I went wrong? We're going to stand today for a minute. Maybe you're here and you're saying, you know what, I've never experienced the presence of God. Maybe you're saying, you know what, I didn't know that someone had came and paid the ultimate price for me. I just want to say I'm so glad that you're here today, that God is waiting for you, that he wants to show you a better way to live your life, a better way to lead your family. And so I just encourage you, if you're someone today that wants to make a choice to follow Jesus and do it his way, that you make that today. And I'm going to pray for you in a second. Secondly, if you're somebody, maybe you've been in the church a while, but you're kind of like on the fence. You're like, Jesus, today I'll follow you, but tomorrow, this just seems more important. But today you want to say, you know what, I want to do it God's way. Even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's inconvenient, I want to choose his way. And so we're going to bow our heads, close our eyes this morning. I'm going to talk to the first group first. If you're today and you've never made the decision to follow God and you want to today, I'm going to count down from the count of 3, and you can just lift up your hand and give me a wave. I'd love to pray for you. If today is the day that you want to know Jesus for the first time, just lift up your hand in 3, 2, 1. And today, if you're someone, you know what? I know my heart hasn't been completely in it. My heart's been distracted by other things. My heart's been going after things that just aren't of God. And you're like, today, I want to turn. I want to be like David did and say, you know what, God, I'm going to do it your way. I'm going to turn, God, I'm going to do it your way when it's hard and uncomfortable. I'm going to find community that can support me. I just invite you, if you want to lift up your hand today and just say, I'm going to follow him in a fresh new way today. Thank you for your hands. I'm just going to pray for you. Jesus, I thank you that your way is better. That, God, you gave it all. You paid the highest price so that we could follow you. God, we just declare that your way is better. And we turn from the ways that we know it's made it about us, made it about my life and what I want. And God, we say today it's all about you. It's all for you. It's all because of you. And nothing else will ever come close to just your presence and your love and your peace. And God, I can't live without your presence. And I can't live without you. We give you all the praise and all the glory. Amen.